Understanding and Treating Childhood Traumatic Stress. The University of Montana's Institute for Educational Research and Service has prepared this presentation in partnership with the Montana Office of Public Instruction. It summarizes more than a decade's worth of solid science that points to a new direction and new opportunities to reverse some of our more persistent social problems. We'll cover this idea in 4 chapters: understanding trauma, treating trauma, secondary trauma, and self-care. The beginning of our understanding of this topic was a landmark ACE study done in California in the mid-90s. It continues as an active study with the Centers for Disease Control and has spawned more than 50 scientific papers and hundreds of conferences. The basis, though, is a questionnaire given to 17,000 people. Here are the questions. Take a minute to go through these. Give yourself a point for each yes answer, then add them up. This is your ACE score, and it tells much about a life. The core findings of the ACE study stunned many people, including the researchers themselves. But the bottom line is that bottom line. This is our nation's leading public health problem. The researchers compared ACE scores to the 10 leading causes of early death, plus a variety of other problems, like this one, suicide attempts. As the ACE score rises, so does the problem, shown on the vertical axis, the percentage of respondents who have attempted suicide. The same with depression, but notice the difference with women, shown here in red. Again, these are the percentages of respondents who suffer depression ranked against the ACE score. The same stair-step pattern shows up in the number of prescriptions for antidepressants ranked against the ACE score. And with smoking, with the ACE score graphed against the percentage of smokers. But also, the same pattern shows up with the illegal intravenous drug use, as it does with prescriptions for antipsychotic drugs and for prescribed medications to reduce anxiety. The ACE score also competently predicts the percentage of respondents who are alcoholics, as it does for the percentage of respondents who experience hallucinations, even if the person does not abuse alcohol or drugs, but also for the percentage of people with impaired memory of childhood. The comparison is particularly striking for teen sexual behaviors in 3 categories, all of them problems in our schools. The same pattern shows up with promiscuity later in life. But the ACE score also shows greatly impaired performance of workers who were abused as children. Thus, this problem is relevant not just to public health, but also has sweeping economic implications. This pattern of self-medication we have seen has side effects, and those lead to graphs like this one, not just for lung disease, but similar graphs for liver and heart disease as well. Recent research has concluded people with high ACE scores die, on average, 20 years earlier than the rest of us. Seldom does science lead to such sweeping conclusions, so it's worth considering what one of the 2 lead scientists on this study has written about this. Please take a minute to read. The second half of this idea was also a very big study that developed independently of the ACE work in California, and it grew from a network established by Congress in 2001. The research was carried out in communities across the nation, mostly impoverished communities, but both urban and rural. That research confirmed the ACE study, but also began to create an understanding of why child abuse has such sweeping and lasting consequences. The key findings implicate trauma as playing a key role, if not the key role, in our nation's leading social and health problems. The core of this issue is that childhood trauma inhibits normal physical brain development, meaning victims can carry lifelong scars and disabilities. This is especially urgent because we know our kids are indeed exposed to a lot of violence. Note this study from the Department of Justice says 60% of our kids are exposed to some sort of violence in any given year, and an ACE score accumulates over the course of 17 years. The same study said 1 in 5 girls will have been the victim of sexual assault or attempted sexual assault by the time she is 17. 1/3 of 17-year-olds saw a parent assaulted, a particularly traumatizing event. A number of events can cause childhood trauma, but research says children with lasting symptoms suffer clusters of events, and clusters most often develop from domestic and interpersonal violence. Sexual abuse and witnessing violence against a child's mother are particularly troubling. At the base of all of this is a normal biological response to fear. For good reason, our subconscious brain sends signals to the rest of our body to deal with the threat, a physical response we call fight, flight, or freeze. Because children's brains are not fully developed, and because they often suffer repeated abuse, the process that turns off their fear response becomes short-circuited. Terror becomes their norm. This, in turn, warps the physical development of the brain, damaging specific areas, especially the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, areas that control memory, learning, language, and judgment. Magnetic resonance imaging technology lets us see brains work. Notice the difference in brain activity, shown as red splotches, when a normal child, then a traumatized child, are shown a photo of a happy face. Children who cannot recognize happiness are alone in this world. In particular, the traumatized child shows no response in a region of the brain called the amygdala, as opposed to a normal child's response indicated by the green circle. The amygdala processes emotion and memory. Interestingly, the same study concluded traumatized adolescents do respond to angry and fearful faces. This tells us that the problem is not that these children refuse to recognize a friendly face. This is evidence that they simply cannot. Not every child who has a bad experience is traumatized. A variety of factors decide both whether trauma occurs, but also the severity and range of problems that accrue. These factors and some innate abilities in some children can make them resilient, able to weather the storms. Bad childhood experiences are important because they often come in clusters. They afflict young brains at critical stages of development and often are inflicted by the very people the child has learned to trust. For all of these reasons, childhood trauma is not a simple matter and is generally called complex trauma, or more recently, developmental trauma. Children who are traumatized can develop an array of symptoms, some of them polar opposites, just as our normal response to a frightening experience can range from fight on one hand to freezing on the other. Basically, though, traumatized people are unable to identify bad memories as memories, but they experience the events as if they are in the present. Their responses and general behavior then divides along two poles, either withdrawal and numbing or aggression and hypervigilance. Reenactment results from a child's extreme preoccupation with a traumatic event, that the past is really in the here and the now. The disorder is often called complex trauma for a reason. It leads to a series of symptoms and problems, often including anxiety and depression. All of these can turn up in a variety of ways as poor performance in school. The good news, however, is that all of this is treatable, often in school-based programs. We can even reverse the stunting of the brain that occurs with childhood trauma. There are many approaches to treatment, but most are modifications of cognitive behavior therapy. One particularly promising approach is a modification that allows a group intervention in schools. The University of Montana's Institute for Educational Research and Service has adopted this practice and has published research concluding it works. The Institute also offers 1- or 2-day workshops to train school counselors to do this intervention. ARC is more of a framework than an intervention, and it guides therapists in approaches targeting 3 specific areas shown here. This intervention is often used with more severely traumatized children or with sexually abused children because their issues cannot be disclosed in a group setting. There are, however, a large number of evidence-based practices and a wide field of research on interventions that are not based in cognitive behavior therapy, but in such methods as relaxation techniques and even exercise. None of these uses medication, at least not in the long term. We are also learning that general trauma awareness in a community helps create a positive atmosphere for helping these kids, and it also helps decision makers understand the roots of the problem and take action. Trauma is unique in another way, though, an issue of great concern to anyone, counselors, therapists, victim advocates, even police officers and judges, people who work with traumatized children. A sense of empathy and years of exposure to severe problems causes these caregivers to develop real traumatic reactions, almost as if it were contagious. Known also as compassion fatigue and burnout, we'll call it secondary trauma here. The problem stems from a number of situations in a person's life. But because this is real trauma, some of the symptoms look very much like those of primary trauma, and in turn can hamper a person's ability to perform a job, leading to work piling up and more trauma, a vicious cycle. Your body's unconscious response systems trigger a response to stress. It's your job to turn it off. Like primary trauma, secondary trauma is treatable. Your working environment has much to do with your well-being. And there are working conditions that make matters worse. To the degree that you have control over these matters, you can help your own situation. Once you know what to look for, and you do now, you can assess your own situation, then begin to take steps to cope. The basics of building well-being require a thorough assessment of your life. But this is more than a thought process. Taking care of yourself in stressful situations requires an action plan that works for you. It requires commitment and daily attention. It's easy to make excuses and avoid this commitment, but remember, the payoffs are considerable. You'll enjoy your work and your life more. You'll be healthier, especially if you commit to a regular program of exercise, one of the most effective measures on this list. And the odds are you will live longer. It's that simple. We offer a link to an in-depth look at self-care at the end of this presentation. At the same time, the benefits of self-care can multiply in the workplace if you adopt a team approach. Take care of yourself, then take care of each other. Now that we have thoroughly explored all aspects of this question, we have a better understanding of how trauma is our nation's leading public health problem. That's another way of saying that each of us, no matter what we do, has a stake in the problem and in the solution. So take care.